Marjorie, they coming for you, sis. Steve Harvey's wife hasn't said much throughout the years, allowing her position as Steve's third wife to be the center of anything Marjorie related. However, Marjorie Harvey's reputation as Steve's stylish arm candy has come under fire, and her highly questionable past has surely spun the block, ready to release fire any given day now. A drug-hoarding, cocaine-dealing, deceitful past full of deception, lies, and betrayal. Hopping from one kingpin to the next, Marjorie once found herself in the midst of one of Memphis's biggest drug busts to date, but is now living lavishly, far from the ruins of that particular lifestyle. So, how did the First Lady of Memphis go from being queen of the drug lords to securing Steve Harvey's bag? Straight from the likes of Tubi, Marjorie Harvey's rags to riches story may be an even bigger one than Steve's. When Steve decided to settle down for the third time with his now wife Marjorie in 2007, he surely believed he'd secure the woman of his dreams, and perhaps he did. But for Marjorie, she surely hit the jackpot, possibly for the third time, just in a much different way, a less incriminating way. It's been about 16 years since Marjorie uttered the words "I do," and over 30 since being entwined with her first husband, one of Memphis City's biggest drug dealers, as well as her second, his alleged cousin. According to Steve, Marjorie first caught his attention in 1990 after showing up late to one of his stand-up shows. Upon landing eyes on her, Steve lessened the gap between his thick lips and the mic and reportedly boasted, "I don't know who this is, but I'm gonna marry her." Steve was serious, but Marjorie was hesitant. After all, she was still very much married. According to Marjorie, she and Steve dated for a bit, but the night outs and gut-filled butterflies dwindled as time went on. Soon enough, the phone calls and communication stopped altogether, and the pursuance of Marjorie came to an abrupt end, with Steve citing his lack of financial stability as to why he and she were no more. As Steve was getting his money up, Marjorie was busy being a ride or die for Jim Townsend, her first husband and former drug dealer who'd run the streets of Memphis, Tennessee. Marjorie right there along with him, but don't be fooled or a fool. Marjorie wasn't just some innocent bystander attending to her 2 babies while her husband made money his way. Let Jim tell it, she was right there along with him participating in his antics. Jimmy Townsend was sentenced to life in prison back in the late 90s after attempting to purchase cocaine the size of an average 12-year-old boy. But before he'd be escorted to the human equivalent of a dog pound, he and Marjorie were king and queen of Memphis's underground drug hoarding ring. The fancy cars and big bank lured Marjorie right on in, and before she knew it, she'd not only married Jim, but would end up conceiving 2 of his kids, Morgan and Jason. Contrary to what many fans of Steve's may have believed, that Marjorie's 3 children all came from one man who isn't Steve, in case you weren't aware. Her first 2 children are in fact the offsprings of her first husband, Jim Townsend. With Jim looking at life in the penitentiary, he and his wife were in this thing for the long run, and absolutely no one was going to get Marjorie to snitch on her man. Not the FBI or the DEA, who investigated Marjorie time and time again, believing that she too was involved in Jim's illegal activities. They even threatened him by telling him they'd arrest Marjorie if she didn't cooperate. Jim wasn't about to spill the beans to the feds and get the mother of his children locked up right along with him, opting to not give away information that could possibly get her imprisoned, but that wouldn't last too long. It'd only take a good 30+ years or so for Jimmy to say, "To hell with everything. I'ma speak my truth since you want to finesse your way into a millionaire's heart and try to keep my kids from me." But before we expose the meat of the entree, we gotta talk about Marjorie's second husband and alleged cousin to her first, Darnell Woods, or as some may refer to as Lori Harvey's real daddy. Just 5 years into Jim's sentence, Marjorie, then pregnant with baby number 2, got tired of sticking by her felon bae and opted out of that marriage and into another, this time with yet another kingpin. Something about that drug hustling life Marjorie couldn't seem to get enough of, eh? Darnell Woods wasn't just any old drug dealer. He too was a part of Memphis, Tennessee's biggest drug sting. Linked to his brothers amongst other relatives, Darnell along with his kin were a part of the infamous Memphis mob gang, founded in the 80s at the height of the crack epidemic that plagued the nation. Using a number of car washes and nightclubs as hotspots, Their notorious martini room attracted big ballers, athletes, and whomever else wanted in on the action. The Memphis mob had a lengthy run before being busted and indicted on several charges, including conspiracy to possess and distribute kilos of cocaine with the intent to distribute marijuana. But before Darnell met the same fate as his alleged cousin Jim, he and Marjorie welcomed their baby girl Lori in 1997 and would end up tying the knot 3 years later before divorcing in 2001. Whole time Marjorie was with Darnell, she still kept tabs on Jim Townsend and vice versa. Whenever Jim hit up her line, Marjorie was right there to answer those collect calls no matter what. After all, Jim was the father of her kids. However, all that prison talk and visits came to an end once Steve found his way back into Marjorie's heart. With Marjorie now a divorced woman, Steve got the word that his ex was back on the market. Despite not being in an actual relationship, Steve just knew Marjorie was the one for him. Reminiscing on his time spent with Marjorie back in the 90s, Steve by this point was finally in a good enough financial and mental state to take care of a woman of Marjorie's caliber. He now was the star of his own TV show, The Steve Harvey Show, and decided the time was now to win over the lady of his dreams. Who cares if he was married to a whole other woman at the time, am I right? All that advice he gives on his popular daytime talk show doesn't amount to this, and his truth. Don't let your wife stop you from finding the love of your life, fellas. Before linking back up with Marjorie in the early 2000s, Steve was a whole married man. Married to his second wife and the mother of his son Winton, Mary Shackelford says she was completely blindsided when Steve hit her with those divorce papers, and even more blindsided when she discovered he was sneaking around with Lady Heroin for Lord knows how long. Not only that, but Mary claims that Marjorie convinced her son Winton to cut all ties with her, and now has her son not only refusing to speak to her, but is out here calling another woman mom, all whilst ignoring his real one. It had been Big Boom, Steve's bodyguard, who had reminded Steve of his more happier days spent with Marjorie, urging Steve to give Marjorie a call, which would turn out to be one of the greatest calls he'd ever make. But before Steve rekindled his and Marjorie's once broken relationship, Ride or Die Marge was tied to yet another man, a former pimp turned bodyguard that the streets are saying was no other than Big Boom himself. Steve and Marjorie decided to take their relationship to the next level in 2007 after they got married, blending their families. The pair have now been married for about 16 years as of 2023, and Steve is more head over heels for Marjorie than he's ever been. However, his ex-wife Mary says it's all a facade. So let us get this straight. Marjorie Harvey was married to 2 kingpin drug dealers, got with Steve Harvey's bodyguard before the bodyguard put in a good word for Marjorie and eventually ended up securing Steve? Talk about playing the game. Y'all don't have to guess where Lori gets her skills from anymore. Despite her dad, Steve, being the author of one of his bestsellers, Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man, apparently she was taught by one of the best to ever do it, her mama. If you don't take our word for it, then how about from the man who knows her probably more than Steve does? Her first husband, Jim, who claims that not only was his ex-wife pushing dough, but knows all about how to finesse a ninja. Jim Townsend, who later get released from prison after being pardoned in 2017 by President Barack Obama, after serving 26 years, is telling it all in his new book, Snakes in the Garden. He'd been working on since his time spent behind bars, and we must say it's a nail-biter. Just check out this excerpt. The sight of Morgan always brought joy to my heart. She was truly the apple of my eye and the only reason I hadn't killed her mother. As Morgan couldn't understand what was happening, she turned her attention back to me and locked eyes with me, giving me a look that said, "Come and get me, Daddy." There were 3 things that I hated and regretted. The first was the abortion issue, which I will explain later. The second was the fact that I allowed Marjorie to convince me to lie to Morgan for 4 years, telling her that I was in Lewisburg working a job while I was in prison. Morgan was 8 when I finally said to hell with Marjorie and her mother and told her the truth. Marjorie and her heartless mother thought I had committed an unpardonable sin by setting things straight with Morgan. But telling her the truth was one of our most intimate and memorable phone conversations. The little 8-year-old rebuked me for lying to her, and she made me promise that I would never lie to her again. Jim is not playing about this tell-all book, and by the looks of it, his kids Morgan and Jason don't give a hoot about their biological daddy spilling the beans about their mama, Cause from what we can tell, Jim has been spending time with them as recently as late 2022. Perhaps this could mean the Harvey household is experiencing some turbulence. Are you getting a copy of Jim Townsend's book? Let us know your thoughts and opinions down below in the comments, and stay tuned for more true celebrity stories.